In today's episode, we're exploring 5 deadly encounters where snake enthusiasts paid the ultimate price, from a respected herpetologist whose overconfidence proved fatal, to a reptile rescuer whose final mistake cost her everything. Let's begin with the first story, where one woman's obsession with venomous serpents led to her downfall. It was March 15th, 2016, and the sprawling desert landscape outside Phoenix, Arizona, stretched endlessly under the late afternoon sun. The isolated ranch-style home sat on 5 acres of scrubland, surrounded by towering saguaro cacti and rocky outcroppings that provided perfect habitat for the region's diverse reptile population. The property's remote location, nearly 20 miles from the nearest neighbor, offered complete privacy for activities that most people would consider unthinkably dangerous. Diane Krueger had been living alone in this desert sanctuary for 8 years, ever since her divorce from a husband who couldn't understand her growing fascination with venomous snakes. At 47, the insurance adjuster had transformed her modest home into something resembling a private zoo, with over 30 species of deadly serpents housed in custom-built enclosures throughout every room. What had started as a casual interest in reptiles during a childhood visit to the zoo had evolved into a consuming obsession that dominated every aspect of her life. Diane's collection represented years of careful acquisition through reptile shows, private breeders, and online forums where enthusiasts traded rare specimens. She had no formal training in herpetology or venom extraction, but considered herself an expert through decades of self-study and hands-on experience. Her neighbors remained blissfully unaware of the deadly menagerie living just miles from their own homes, and Diane preferred it that way. The crown jewel of her collection was a magnificent 6-foot eastern diamondback rattlesnake that she had acquired just 2 weeks earlier from a breeder in Georgia. The massive serpent, with its distinctive diamond-patterned scales and considerable size, was regarded as one of the most formidable venomous snakes in North America among experienced handlers. Eastern diamondback rattlesnakes are the largest venomous snakes in North America, with adults commonly reaching 5 to 6 feet in length and weighing several pounds. Their venom is primarily hemotoxic, capable of causing rapid swelling, significant tissue damage, clotting disruption, and systemic shock without prompt medical treatment. Large individuals can deliver substantial venom in a single defensive strike, and severe envenomations can become life-threatening if care is delayed, especially in remote areas where response times are extended. That Sunday evening, a partially filled glass of wine was found on the kitchen counter, and feeding tools were laid out nearby, indicating she had been tending to her collection before the incident. The enclosure for the eastern diamondback was open, and the water bowl had been removed, suggesting she began routine cleaning while moving through her feeding tasks. Diane opened the custom-built terrarium and reached across the enclosure to remove the water bowl. Gloves and handling tools were present in the room, but were not in use when responders later examined the scene. The terrarium door was fully open, the bowl was positioned on the table beside her tools, and the placement suggested she was midway through a routine cleaning step when the incident occurred. When investigators arrived, the eastern diamondback was found coiled at the rear of the enclosure, a posture consistent with a defensive response after a disturbance. Based on the angle of the bite marks on Diane's forearm and the blood pattern on the floor, her arm entered the snake's strike range while she was reaching inside the enclosure. Eastern diamondbacks deliver extremely fast defensive strikes, and the wound spacing matched a rapid forward extension typical for the species. The puncture depth on her forearm indicated a full strike and release, which aligns with the species' normal behavior. Large rattlesnakes typically inject significant venom during such strikes, and the immediate swelling and blood loss documented at the scene were consistent with a high-volume envenomation. After striking, the snake retreated to the back corner, where it remained until responders secured it. Blood from the puncture wounds formed a trail from the enclosure toward the adjacent room, indicating she moved away immediately after the bite. Her phone was recovered on the floor nearby, consistent with an attempted call. Rapid swelling, discoloration, and bleeding at the bite site matched significant hemotoxic envenomation. Without antivenom, systemic effects typically progress progress over hours, producing increasing weakness and impaired coordination. The extent of swelling, discoloration, and tissue damage observed during examination reflected the progression of untreated hemotoxic envenomation. Such effects can lead to shock and organ failure without rapid antivenom administration, and the remote location significantly delayed any chance of medical intervention. With no access to immediate care, she deteriorated over the next several hours and ultimately lost consciousness inside the home. A postal worker discovered Diane's body 3 days later when accumulated mail raised concern. Responding officers found numerous venomous snakes housed throughout the residence, some in improvised enclosures, but all were contained. Wildlife officials temporarily seized the animals for evaluation and initiated a review of her permits and housing conditions. Local authorities later examined existing exotic animal oversight procedures but did not implement immediate law changes. But Diane wasn't the only snake enthusiast whose expertise failed them when it mattered most. In Florida, a respected researcher's overconfidence would prove fatal during what should have been a routine procedure. It was August 22, 2014, and the small private herpetology research lab where Dr. Michael Webb worked had already gone quiet for the evening. The facility sat on the outskirts of a rural Florida town, housed in a modest single-story building used by a handful of contracted researchers studying regional reptile species. After hours, the empty hallways, locked offices, and dim lighting gave the place a stillness that often left late-working staff completely alone. Dr. Michael Webb had been working late in the lab for weeks, driven by mounting pressure to produce results necessary to renew his research contract. At 38, the respected herpetologist had built his reputation on groundbreaking studies of coral snake neurotoxins, but recent funding cuts had forced him to accelerate his research timeline. His colleagues had gone home hours earlier, leaving Michael alone with his specimens and his growing sense of urgency. Michael's research focused on the unique properties of coral snake venom, which differed significantly from the hemotoxic venoms of rattlesnakes and vipers. His work had potential applications for developing new neurological medications, but the delicate process of venom extraction required precise timing and absolute safety protocols. Internal emails and previous lab notes showed he frequently expressed frustration with what he considered overly cautious procedures. The lab's safety regulations required 2 researchers to be present during any venom extraction procedures, along with comprehensive protective equipment and emergency protocols. Michael had been circumventing these rules for months, working alone after hours to avoid oversight and accelerate his research progress. Coral snakes are among North America's most medically significant venomous snakes. Despite their small size and reclusive behavior, these slender reptiles rarely exceed 2 feet in length, but their venom contains neurotoxins that interfere with nerve signaling and can lead to progressive paralysis. Early symptoms may include subtle changes such as slurred speech or difficulty swallowing, with respiratory impairment developing later as the paralysis advances. Because coral snake bites often produce little pain, minimal swelling, and only tiny puncture marks, the envenomation can appear deceptively mild at first, with serious symptoms emerging gradually over several hours if untreated. That Friday evening, Michael was working with a particularly active coral snake specimen that had been recently captured for his research. The small serpent, with its distinctive red, black, and yellow banded pattern, appeared far less imposing than the larger vipers he regularly handled. Its small size and bright coloration, traits that often lead handlers to underestimate coral snakes, had been noted in Michael's previous handling logs, providing context for the reduced caution seen in the footage that night. Michael performed the venom extraction procedure without the required second researcher present, as confirmed by facility access logs and internal camera footage. Handling tools were available on the workstation, but the footage showed him attempting to position the coral snake manually rather than following the lab's standard restraint protocols. As he adjusted his grip, the coral snake delivered a quick, close-range bite to his thumb, a common defensive response during handling. Footage showed the snake maintaining contact for a brief moment, long enough to allow venom delivery, which is typical when coral snakes secure a bite rather than striking and releasing. The small fangs produced 2 faint punctures, and available footage showed him repositioning the animal immediately afterward, unaware of the severity of the envenomation. The bite appeared minor, leaving only tiny puncture marks with no immediate pain or swelling, features typical of coral snake envenomation. Security footage captured him returning to his workstation and continuing his notes, behavior consistent with not recognizing the bite as medically serious. Within about 30 minutes, Michael began showing early signs of neurotoxic envenomation. Lab timestamps and handwriting irregularities in his notes indicated slurred speech and visual difficulty, symptoms consistent with interference of cranial nerve function caused by coral snake venom. As the evening progressed, his condition worsened. Object handling captured on camera became increasingly uncoordinated, and a recorded attempt to call for help revealed speech that was difficult to understand. The call did not provide enough information for dispatchers to identify his location or the nature of his emergency. Neurotoxic effects continued to develop, leading to progressive muscle weakness and impaired respiratory function. Footage showed him bracing against the desk, with increasingly shallow breathing consistent with advancing paralysis of the muscles needed for respiration. Sometime later that night, Michael lost consciousness at his workstation as respiratory failure progressed. With the facility locked for the evening and no co-workers present, there was no opportunity for timely assistance. He was found the following morning during a routine security check. The subsequent investigation documented repeated violations of safety protocols and a pattern of working alone with venomous specimens. Following the incident, the lab's management reviewed and tightened its internal procedures, emphasizing proper oversight and mandatory 2-person operations during high-risk work. Yet lab researchers weren't the only people whose familiarity with venomous snakes led to fatal mistakes. In Texas, a veterinary technician's first encounter with an exotic species would prove to be her last. It was June 8, 2017. And the suburban neighborhood in Houston, Texas buzzed with the typical activity of a warm summer evening. Children played in front yards while parents tended gardens, and neighbors chatted over fence lines, creating the picture of American suburban tranquility. Behind the walls of one modest ranch home, however, a far more dangerous reality existed that none of the friendly neighbors could have imagined. Jennifer Valdez had been living her double life for over 2 years, maintaining the appearance of a normal 29-year-old veterinary technician while secretly housing a collection of exotic venomous snakes in her spare bedroom. Her work at a local animal clinic had sparked an interest in reptiles that quickly evolved into an obsession with the most dangerous species she could legally acquire. Jennifer's collection had grown through careful purchases at reptile shows and online dealers, where she had built relationships with breeders who specialized in venomous species. She kept her hobby completely secret from friends, family, and co-workers, knowing that most people would consider her passion both dangerous and irresponsible. Her latest acquisition was a juvenile gaboon viper that she had purchased from a private breeder just 1 month earlier. The snake represented a significant step up in danger from her previous collection of rattlesnakes and copperheads. Records from her purchases and handling logs showed she had been gradually acquiring more challenging species, indicating a consistent pattern of increasing risk in the reptiles she chose to keep. Gaboon vipers are large African vipers, known for their thick bodies, broad heads, and exceptionally long fangs relative to their size. Adult specimens can exceed 6 feet and weigh more than 20 pounds, but juveniles, like the one Jennifer kept, are smaller with proportionally shorter fangs. Their venom is primarily hemotoxic and cytotoxic, capable of causing extensive tissue damage, severe bleeding, and dangerous drops in blood pressure, if not treated quickly. Although the species is capable of delivering large venom volumes, the effects vary depending on the size of the snake and the depth of the bite. Jennifer prepared to transfer the gaboon viper into a secured holding tub so she could perform routine enclosure maintenance. The open tub, a snake hook, and cleaning tools were found arranged beside the terrarium, indicating she was in the middle of a standard transfer procedure rather than casual cleaning. The position of the overturned tub and scattered equipment showed that the snake slipped from the hook during the transfer, landing on the enclosure floor near the opening. Gaboon vipers are heavy-bodied ambush ambush predators, and even smaller specimens can shift their weight unexpectedly during handling. Based on the viper's final position, it had come to rest only a short distance from Jennifer's reach. When she attempted to redirect it toward the tub, the snake reacted at close range. From this short distance, the Gaboon viper thrust forward in a powerful ambush-style strike. Bite marks on Jennifer's forearm showed deep penetration from fangs consistent with a juvenile specimen, and the surrounding blood pattern indicated a rapid, high-volume envenomation. After biting, the snake remained near the enclosure opening until responders later secured it. Evidence of the envenomation's effects appeared quickly. Blood droplets and a smeared handprint on the hallway wall showed she tried to steady herself as she moved toward the living room. Her bag of cleaning supplies was found overturned near the couch, suggesting she may have reached for it out of habit before her strength declined. Over the next 30 to 60 minutes, swelling and bleeding at the bite site progressed, and indicators in the living room, a collapsed posture near the couch and pooled blood on the floor, showed she attempted to sit before losing consciousness. When paramedics entered the home, they found Jennifer unresponsive and in cardiac arrest. Despite resuscitation attempts, the severity of the envenomation and the absence of appropriate antivenom in the region left no viable path for reversal. Following her death, wildlife officers initiated a review of her permits and handling practices, and the incident prompted renewed discussion among local officials about the risks associated with keeping exotic venomous species in residential areas. Wildlife officers and animal control personnel secured the Gaboon viper on scene and transported it to a permitted holding facility. The remaining snakes in Jennifer's spare bedroom were removed for evaluation, as several species required state verification of proper documentation. Her employer at the veterinary clinic confirmed that none of the animals had ever been brought onto clinic property, so the workplace remained open, though staff were notified as part of the investigation's standard questioning. The home remained cordoned off for several hours while officers completed enclosure checks and inventory before it was released to her family. No immediate legal penalties were issued, but her permits and housing conditions were formally reviewed as part of routine post-incident procedures. However, exotic pet owners weren't the only people whose religious or personal beliefs put them in mortal danger around venomous snakes. In Tennessee, a preacher's crisis of faith would lead to a deadly test of divine protection. It was September 14th, 2015, and the small mountain chapel tucked deep in a remote Tennessee valley stood silent in the fading light. The wooden structure used for decades by a tiny independent congregation with its own traditions relied on the privacy of the surrounding hills to practice rituals not commonly seen outside the region. Reverend Samuel Briggs had been the spiritual leader of this small congregation for over 2 decades, following in the footsteps of his father and grandfather, who had established the serpent handling tradition in their family. At 54, Samuel had handled venomous snakes in religious services for most of his adult life, surviving 2 previous bites that he attributed to divine intervention and the power of faith. Samuel's personal collection of rattlesnakes and copperheads was housed in simple wooden boxes behind the church altar, where they waited to be called into service during worship. The snakes were considered sacred instruments of faith based on biblical passages that promised protection from serpents for true believers. Recent entries in Samuel's journals, later reviewed by investigators, described periods of difficulty maintaining the certainty he once expressed during services. Family members also reported that he had been spending more evenings alone at the chapel in the weeks prior, remaining long after scheduled activities had ended. Timber rattlesnakes are large forest-dwelling pit vipers capable of delivering substantial hemotoxic envenomation. Adults commonly reach 4 to 5 feet in length, and their fangs can exceed half an inch. Their venom disrupts blood clotting and damages tissue, and severe untreated bites, especially multiple bites at close range, can become life-threatening over several hours. That Wednesday evening, Samuel entered the empty church alone, carrying his largest timber rattlesnake in a simple wooden box. The massive serpent, nearly 5 feet in length, represented the most dangerous snake in his collection and had been used in countless worship services over the years. Samuel's presence in the chapel that evening was documented only through the items found near the altar: the wooden box, an open Bible, and a chair pulled close to the front. His recent journal entries indicated he had been reflecting on his responsibilities within the congregation, which may explain why he chose to handle the snake alone that night, rather than during a service. When he opened the wooden box and reached inside, the timber rattlesnake reacted defensively to the sudden close contact. In the confined space, Samuel's hand stayed within striking distance as he attempted to lift the snake, and the animal delivered several rapid bites, behavior consistent with close proximity handling incidents documented in similar cases. Bite marks on both hands and forearms showed different angles of penetration, indicating multiple strikes at very short range. Samuel dropped the snake and attempted to return it to its container, but the multiple envenomations had already begun affecting his coordination. Blood droplets on the floor and smudges on the side of a nearby pew indicated he tried to steady himself while moving away from the altar. The effects began progressing within the first hour, with swelling, bleeding, and falling blood pressure worsening steadily as the night went on. Bloodstains near the front pews and the position of a fallen chair suggested he attempted to move toward the exit before collapsing. The hemotoxic venom caused extensive swelling, impaired clotting, and a significant drop in blood pressure, eventually leading to loss of consciousness. Samuel's wife discovered him the following morning when he did not return home. Responders found the wooden box open near the altar and the timber rattlesnake coiled on the floor a short distance away, its location consistent with having been dropped during the handling attempt. Wildlife officers later secured the snake and transferred it to a permitted holding facility for evaluation. The county sheriff's office documented the scene, and the medical examiner determined the cause of death to be complications from untreated hemotoxic envenomation following multiple bites. With no indication of foul play, the investigation remained limited to routine reporting. The small independent congregation later discussed the incident privately, with differing views about the continuation of the long-standing ritual. But religious snake handlers weren't the only people whose work with venomous reptiles carried fatal risks. In another case, a reptile rehabilitator's routine transfer would end in tragedy. It was November 3, 2013, in rural northeastern Namibia. A dry heat lingered under a pale sky as wind pushed dust across stretches of thorn scrub and scattered mopane trees. The tin roof of a small reptile rehabilitation outbuilding clicked softly as the metal shifted in the afternoon breeze. Inside the dim structure, wooden racks held plastic tubs and repurposed glass enclosures labeled in fading marker. The place was quiet in the way remote stations often are, where every sound, from a hinge settling to a sliding bin or a glove brushing plywood, seemed sharper than it should be. Selma Kashipa ran the rescue alone most days. At 41, she had left elementary teaching to take in snakes nobody else wanted, confiscations, surrenders, animals from failed roadside shows. She lived in a small trailer on the edge of the 20-acre property and kept a strict routine: feed logs, cleaning rotations, evening walkthroughs, so inspectors would find order even where money was short. Venomous intakes were recent and often arrived with little notice. She handled them with the tools she could afford and the practices she had learned from manuals and field guides. Donors knew her as steady and practical. She built racks from salvaged lumber, stretched every gallon of disinfectant, and drove borrowed coolers of non-venomous colubrids to school programs on weekends. Local officials started calling when other groups declined to take certain confiscations. Anti-venom and rapid transport were not resources she had. Reliable medical support could be hours away. The rescue sat behind a wind-bent line of pines. A sand road cut to the outbuildings, where a lean-to covered 2 long shelves of enclosures. Light bled through board seams. The concrete floor was chalked with lime to mark walking lanes. A portable camera pointed down the main aisle to record husbandry and deter trespassers. Her latest intake that week had been a seized black mamba, taken from a private owner who was keeping it illegally. Black mambas are native African elapids with potent neurotoxic venom and high venom yields for their size. Adults commonly exceed 6 feet in length, move quickly when provoked, and deliver venom that can cause progressive neuromuscular paralysis and respiratory failure without rapid anti-venom and airway support. In remote regions where medical access is limited, the risk of rapid respiratory compromise rises substantially. Warnings had been stacking up in small ways. 2 weeks earlier, a volunteer sent photos showing a sagging upper rack. Brackets were rusted, and one screw head rounded smooth. Selma made a note to replace the supports, but kept feeding the animals that day. A notice from regional wildlife authorities had reminded permit holders to avoid solo work with dangerous species and to stage transfers at waist height. She acknowledged the message in a reply, but lacked extra hands. On the afternoon the incident occurred, the video shows her staging the move at dusk. A new glass tank sat on the suspect upper rack. A hook, a clear shield, and a pair of thin work gloves lay within reach. She slid the vented transport tub toward the shelf, left hand under the lip, right hand steadying. As the tub met the shelf edge, the front bracket shifted. The plank dipped a half-inch. The tank slid forward, and she reached to steady multiple enclosures. The mamba was pressed near the handle inside the vented tub. As the sudden slide tilted the container, the lid bounced. She steadied the tub with her left forearm and pushed with her right. The only path the snake had was toward the opening and the large warm object blocking it. From inches away, in confined space, a defensive strike occurred. In the confined opening of the tilted tub, the mamba delivered a single defensive strike before pulling back, a pattern documented when the snake has limited space to follow with additional bites. The camera misses the initial strike, but captures the immediate aftermath, a sharp jerk, the tub clattering to the floor, a hand lifted toward her collarbone as she stumbled back into the aisle. Blood appeared on the concrete and on the glove cuff. Later photographs showed 2 puncture wounds on the inner forearm, where the fabric split. The hook clanged on the rack and lay still. The clear shield bore a smeared mark. She moved toward the office and opened a drawer where she kept gauze and antiseptic. The partially unwound gauze and scissors on the desk indicated an attempt at basic wound management. Her phone remained on the opposite counter, undisturbed. The scene suggested she focused first on stabilizing the immediate area, standard practice at the facility, before her symptoms progressed too far for further action. Within minutes, the recorded footage shows her posture change. Speech, when audible on the brief recovered clip, had become slurred and her breathing quicker. Early neurotoxic effects often begin with subtle cranial nerve impairment, difficulty focusing, drooping eyelids, and unsteady movements. In the recording, the progression is visible. She steadied herself on the desk before lowering into a chair as limb strength declined. Over the next 45 minutes, the deterioration continued. The camera captured increasingly shallow breathing, intermittent attempts to reposition herself, and long periods of immobility. A trail of drops led from the office back toward the aisle and ended beside a folding chair. A bottle of saline lay on its side. The combination of rapid neurotoxin onset, lack of antivenom, and the facility's isolation left no practical path to the airway support required for survival. The footage recorded her sliding partially out of the chair a little over an hour after the bite. No further movement followed. A volunteer arrived after dark for a scheduled check-in when messages went unanswered. He found the office light on, the phone on the floor, and Selma slumped near the chair with shallow pooling beneath her arm. He backed away and called 911 from the road. Paramedics reached the property and confirmed cardiac arrest. Animal control officers secured the mamba using tongs and a transport box before transferring it to a permitted facility. The medical examiner listed the cause of death as complications of untreated neurotoxic envenomation with respiratory failure. The punctured glove, the displaced shelf, and the scattered hardware matched a structural failure during an enclosure move. Remaining animals were inventoried and relocated over the next 2 days. Regional wildlife officers documented the scene and noted the solo work, absent antivenom, and deteriorating rack supports. No broader penalties were issued. The rescue closed quietly. Neighbors collected her personal effects, and the camera's final clip, recorded after the property was cleared, shows the upper rack still a fraction low on the right bracket. A small mechanical fault that, in the end, set the rest in motion. Thanks for watching. Enjoy this video? Click more.